There's a particular quality to suffering that refuses to be medicated away. A heaviness that returns the moment the pill wears off. An anxiety that knows something you're trying not to know. A restlessness in a life that looks successful from the outside, but feels hollow from within. You've been taught this is malfunction, a chemical imbalance, a broken brain, symptoms to be managed or eliminated until you return to comfortable functioning. The prevailing paradigm treats your depression, your anxiety, your burnout as biochemical defects, intruders within the psyche to be excised. The medical model operates on a simple premise: restore you to baseline comfort, get you back to work, back to the life you were living before the symptoms arrived. And this approach works for acute stabilization, for crisis intervention, for keeping you alive when the edge feels too close. But something else is happening in that moment when the medication suppresses the symptom without addressing what summoned it. The deeper signal gets silenced. The psyche's alarm system muffled. Because what if this isn't malfunction at all? Carl Jung spent a lifetime studying the architecture of the human psyche and arrived at a radical proposition. The psyche is a self-regulating system, much like the body. When you get a fever, your body isn't malfunctioning. It's attempting to burn out an infection. The fever is meaningful. It has purpose. Your psychological symptoms operate the same way. Depression, anxiety, the inexplicable panic that grips you in the middle of a normal Tuesday, these aren't errors, they're protests. Communications from the unconscious against a conscious life that has become too narrow, too inauthentic, too misaligned with who you actually are. Jung called this the teleology of symptoms. The idea that your neurosis has a purpose and a goal. The suffering isn't random. It's directional. It's pointing you towards something. This reframes everything. The modern epidemic of mental distress isn't a disease to be cured. It's a summons to be heeded. It's your psyche withdrawing energy from a life that no longer resonates with your deeper nature, what Jung called the self, the center of the total psyche, distinct from the ego's center of consciousness. When the ego clings rigidly to a social mask, a provisional personality constructed to ensure survival and approval, the self pulls the plug on the energy supply. You feel this as depression, as the damming up of libido, psychic energy that refuses to flow into the old channels of the unlived or false life. The suffering isn't the enemy. It's the friction caused by the soul's demand for growth. To medicate this away without understanding its message is to trap yourself in arrested development, adapted to a life that feels increasingly fraudulent and empty, still functional, still performing, still dying inside. Human development in the first half of life is primarily concerned with one thing: survival through adaptation. You arrived in this world utterly dependent on caregivers for your continued existence. And you learned quickly, with the precision of a trapped animal, which aspects of your personality secured love and safety, and which threatened attachment. The child learns to silence the howl, to soften the sharp edges, to perform the version that keeps the adults calm. You amplified the qualities that got you praised, you buried the ones that got you punished or ignored. This wasn't conscious strategy. This was survival architecture. Jung called the amplified parts the persona, your social mask, the acceptable face you show the world. The buried parts became your shadow, everything you repressed to maintain that mask. Your aggression, your sexuality, your vulnerability, sometimes even your intense creativity or your hunger for solitude. Anything that didn't fit the family's tolerance or the culture's approval got shoved underground. Jungian analyst James Hollis named the resulting structure the provisional personality. It's a defensive system, a set of adaptations and reflexes acquired to navigate what he called the giants of childhood, the overwhelming powers of parents, siblings, institutions. And this provisional personality is necessary. You needed it to survive, but somewhere along the way, you mistook it for your true self. You entered adulthood living what Hollis calls a borrowed life, driven by scripts written by family complexes and cultural collectives rather than by your own inner authority. The successful career that was actually your father's unlived ambition, the relationship that replicated your mother's marriage template, the personality that earned approval but never quite felt like yours. And all the while, the unlived life accumulates. Jung warned that the unlived life of the parent is the greatest burden on the child. But equally, the unlived life within you becomes the greatest burden on your ego. Your shadow isn't merely a reservoir of evil. It contains all the vitality, all the instinct, all the potential that was sacrificed at the altar of adaptation. The parts of you that were too much, too wild, too honest, too hungry, they didn't disappear. They went underground, waiting. The psyche groans under the weight of what wasn't lived, what wasn't expressed, what wasn't honored, and when the gap between your conscious persona and your unconscious shadow becomes too wide, the psyche's homeostatic mechanism triggers a counter-reaction. This is neurosis, a state of internal conflict, where the repressed energy pushes upward, disrupting the ego's control. The successful executive who suddenly encounters panic attacks at the height of their career. The perfect parent who falls into debilitating depression despite having everything they thought they wanted. These aren't random breakdowns. They're the collapse of the provisional personality. The psyche can no longer support the lie of the false self. The structure you built to survive childhood is now suffocating the adult you're trying to become. And your symptoms, the anxiety, the depression, the inexplicable exhaustion, are the sound of something inside you refusing to continue the performance. Jung arrived at one of his most penetrating insights through decades of clinical work. Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Read that again. Because it changes everything about how you understand your own pain. There are two kinds of suffering in human existence. Legitimate suffering encompasses the unavoidable realities of being alive, the grief of loss, the inevitability of death, the isolation of consciousness, the weight of taking responsibility for your choices. This is existential pain. It comes with the territory of being human. It cannot be bypassed, only endured and integrated. But when you lack the emotional tools or support to face this legitimate suffering, when the pain feels unbearable or when you learned early that certain feelings weren't allowed, the psyche doesn't let the suffering disappear. It displaces it. The pain transforms into neurotic symptoms. The real suffering would crack you open. The neurotic suffering keeps you in a loop. Consider the person consumed by health anxiety, checking their body obsessively for signs of disease, Googling symptoms at 3 a.m, the checking, the scanning, the doctor visits. This is a ritual that keeps a vast, formless dread at arm's length. Because underneath the specific fear of illness lives something far more terrifying, the unacknowledged reality of mortality itself, or perhaps the sense of an unlived life racing toward its end. The neurosis serves a protective function. It binds the existential anxiety into a manageable form. As long as they're worrying about a specific ailment, they don't have to face the void of their mortality or the unbearable question of whether they're living authentically. The neurotic suffering creates a static loop, repetitive, exhausting, but ultimately safer than the transformative encounter with reality. This is the mechanism of substitution Jung identified. The legitimate suffering is too overwhelming to meet directly, so the psyche offers a proxy, a neurotic symptom, that absorbs the energy and attention. You suffer, yes, but you suffer in a way that prevents the deeper transformation. The distinction isn't about intensity. Neurotic suffering can be agonizing, debilitating, but its function differs fundamentally. Legitimate suffering processes the experience, leads to integration, burns you into a more mature version of yourself. Neurotic suffering blocks that processing. It creates chronic anxiety instead of acute grief, vague dread instead of specific fear, psychosomatic pain instead of emotional confrontation, compulsions instead of choices. And the therapeutic goal shifts completely based on this understanding. The work isn't to eliminate the neurotic suffering by managing symptoms. The work is to dissolve the neurosis by uncovering the underlying legitimate pain and then helping you face it directly. To convert the substitute back into the real. To exchange the proxy suffering for the actual suffering that was always waiting beneath it. Not out, but through. This is why Jung's approach felt brutal to some patients. He wasn't interested in making them comfortable. He was interested in making them whole. And wholeness requires feeling what you've been avoiding. It requires descending into the legitimate suffering you substituted away and allowing it to transform you. Depression, from the Jungian perspective, is rarely just a low mood. It's a withdrawal of libido, psychic energy, from the external world. When your outer life no longer resonates with your inner self, the self pulls the plug on the energy supply. The heaviness isn't the problem. It's the psyche's gravitational pull, dragging you inward because the outer life has become a performance. You feel dead to the world because your energy has gone underground, refusing to animate the false self any longer. The job that once excited you now feels meaningless. The relationships feel hollow. The activities that filled your calendar drain you rather than sustain you. This isn't pathology, this is redirection. The psyche is forcing an introversion, a turning inward toward the necessary work of examining what's been ignored. The depression says, the life you're living doesn't fit anymore. Stop pouring energy into it. Turn around and look at what you've been avoiding. Anxiety operates differently, but with equal precision. It's the signal that your life has become too narrow to contain your expanding consciousness. You feel like you're vibrating at a frequency your current structure can't accommodate. The personality you constructed, with its careful boundaries, its acceptable roles, its predictable patterns, can no longer hold the energy of who you're becoming. The restlessness isn't irrational. It's your psyche recognizing unlived potential pressing against the walls of the small life. The panic isn't a malfunction. It's the somatic experience of outgrowing your own architecture. Your body knows before your mind does that you can't stay in this shape anymore, and then there's burnout, perhaps the most misunderstood signal of all. You interpret it as exhaustion from working too hard, but Jungian analysis reveals something more surgical. Burnout is the psyche's refusal to energize an inauthentic role. Your body won't let you continue the lie. You can push through physical tiredness. You can override hunger, ignore pain, suppress emotions. But when the psyche withdraws its cooperation, when it stops providing the energy to maintain the provisional personality, the collapse is total. You can't think clearly, can't focus, can't summon the enthusiasm that used to come naturally. This isn't weakness. This is the self saying, I will not participate in this fraud any longer. The executive who climbs to the top of a ladder only to realize it's leaning against the wrong wall. The caregiver who's performed the role so perfectly they've erased themselves. The perfectionist who's maintained the image while hemorrhaging vitality. These individuals hit burnout not because they worked too hard, but because they worked too long at being someone they're not. Each symptom, depression, anxiety, burnout, is a specific communication in the soul's vocabulary. Depression redirects energy inward. Anxiety signals outgrown structure. Burnout refuses complicity with the false self. They aren't random afflictions. They're purposeful interventions. Jung and his successors identified a developmental threshold they called the middle passage, a transition that typically arrives somewhere between the late 30s and early 50s, though its timing varies by individual. This isn't a breakdown, it's an initiation. The scaffolding that held everything together just dissolves, and you're standing in the rubble wondering who you actually are. The first half of life concerns itself with ego formation, social adaptation, achievement. You build a career, establish relationships, accumulate credentials and accomplishments, construct a recognizable self that functions in the world. The provisional personality you developed in childhood gets reinforced by success, promotions, marriages, milestones that seem to validate the choices you made. But then the adaptations that worked so well stop working. The marriage that looked stable reveals its foundational cracks. The career that provided identity starts feeling like a costume you can't remove. The goals you pursued lose their magnetic pull. What felt like solid ground becomes quicksand, and the questions emerge with visceral urgency. Whose life am I living? What did I sacrifice to get here? What parts of myself did I bury to maintain this acceptable version? This is the middle passage. The collapse of the provisional life under the weight of its own inauthenticity. Jung understood this as a necessary death, the dismantling of the false self to make room for the true self to emerge. The first half of life built the ego. The second half must discover what transcends it. The transition is disorienting because everything you learned to trust, your strategies for success, your methods of control, your ability to perform competence, suddenly fails you. The personality structure you spent decades constructing can no longer contain who you're becoming. You're being asked to move from external validation to inner meaning, from achievement to authenticity, from building a life others recognize to living a life that resonates with your own depths. This is the opportunity embedded in the crisis. The breakdown creates an opening. The provisional personality's collapse isn't the end, it's the beginning of actual individuation. The chance to stop living a borrowed life and start inhabiting your own. To integrate the shadow material you've been suppressing. To discover what your soul has been trying to tell you through the symptoms you've been medicating. But this requires a choice. You can medicate yourself back into the old life. Use antidepressants to tolerate the intolerable. Anxiolytics to suppress the warning signals. Stimulants to keep performing the role. You can rebuild the same structure with slightly different materials and call it healing. Or you can answer the summons. Accept that the suffering is labor pains. The self trying to be born through the cracks in your persona. Recognize that the crisis is sacred, the symptoms are speaking, and the dissolution is preparation for something more true. Jung developed specific methodologies for translating the symbolic language of the unconscious into conscious understanding. These aren't exercises. They're technologies for dialoguing with the depths. Dreams are what Jung called the objective facts of the psyche, unadulterated snapshots of your inner situation, unfiltered by ego defenses or social performance. While you sleep, the unconscious speaks without interference. The question is whether you're willing to listen. Jungian analyst Robert Johnson outlined a 4-step method for working with dreams. First, associations. You list every personal association with each dream image. The blue cat in your dream. Where have you encountered blue cats? What does blue mean to you? What about cats? This grounds the archetypal image in your specific emotional reality. Second, dynamics. You connect these associations to your internal life. Maybe the blue cat reminds you of your aunt's house, and your aunt represents a rigid conscience. Now you're identifying the complexes currently active in your psyche. Third, interpretations. You synthesize the message. Perhaps your rigid conscience is starving your instinctual nature. The dream brings the unconscious conflict into conscious awareness with surgical precision. Fourth, and this is where most people stop prematurely, rituals. You perform a physical act to honor the insight. Light a candle, draw the image, write a letter to the dream figure. This moves the understanding from your intellect to your body, signaling to the unconscious that the message was received. The dream isn't a puzzle to solve intellectually. It's a message to embody. But dreams are passive. They arrive unbidden. Active imagination is the counterpart, the deliberate conscious engagement with unconscious figures. This is Jung's primary tool for shadow work and integrating the unlived life. The process has 4 stages. First, invitation. You enter a meditative state and invite a figure to appear, a mood, a symptom, a dream character, an emotion that's been haunting you. You wait, something emerges. Second, dialogue. This is crucial. You're not surrendering to the figure. You're not being possessed by it. Your ego maintains its position while engaging in conversation. You ask questions, you argue, you negotiate. Why are you depressing me? What do you want? What happens if I give you that? Third, ethical confrontation. If a shadow figure demands you destroy your marriage or quit your job or harm someone, you don't act it out. You maintain your ethical stance while exploring the meaning of the impulse. What legitimate need is being expressed through this destructive fantasy? Fourth, integration. The energy that was bound up in the figure gets assimilated. The depression lifts. Not because you medicated it, but because you heard its voice and redirected its energy. The anxiety dissipates because you've expanded your structure to accommodate what was pushing against it. You're not surrendering to the mood. You're sitting across from it, asking it questions. And none of this remains theoretical. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio confirmed what Jung intuited. Emotions are somatic markers, bodily states that precede conscious thought. Your psyche is embodied. The grief lives in your chest. The rage moves through your arms. The shame contracts your throat. Healing requires embodied immediacy, feeling the legitimate suffering in the tissues of your body, not just analyzing it from the safety of your intellect. Neurosis often involves dissociation from the body, living exclusively in your head. The cure involves descending into the somatic experience of the emotion, allowing it to move through your nervous system without blockage or suppression. This isn't metaphorical. The work is physical. Depth psychology makes a critical distinction between curing and healing, and understanding this difference changes how you approach your suffering. Curing means symptom removal, restoration to the previous state of functioning. It's restorative. You return to baseline, back to the life you were living before the crisis arrived. Healing, on the other hand, relates to wholeness. It involves transformation, incorporating the suffering into a larger sense of self. You can be healed, made whole, even if the complete cure remains impossible. Curing closes the wound, healing integrates the scar into who you become. Jungian analysts caution that indiscriminate psychopharmacology can abort the individuation process. If anxiety is your psyche's signal that your life has become too small, removing the anxiety with SSRIs without concurrent depth work allows you to remain in the small life. It reinforces the provisional personality, silences the soul's protest. As James Hollis observed, medication often helps us tolerate the intolerable. It enables us to persist in jobs, marriages, lifestyles that violate our deeper nature. The chemical imbalance theory can become a defense mechanism, absolving the ego of responsibility to examine what the distress actually means. If anxiety is the alarm that your life is too small, turning off the alarm doesn't expand the life. But the Jungian view isn't anti-medication. It's anti-suppression. In cases of severe crisis, when the ego is threatened with disintegration through psychosis or suicidal depression, medication functions as a necessary life jacket. It stabilizes you enough to engage in the actual work of therapy. It prevents drowning while you learn to swim. The danger lies in mistaking the life jacket for the destination. The goal is to use the stability medication provides to perform the surgery of analysis, to confront the shadow, integrate the unlived life, realign your existence with your depths. Not to numb yourself into a zombie-like state of adaptation, where you're functional but hollow, performing but not present. The question isn't medication yes or no. The question is, are we using this to do the work or to avoid it? Are we stabilizing the ego so it can face the legitimate suffering, or are we suppressing the symptoms so we can continue the lie? This distinction matters because it determines whether your suffering becomes transformative or merely tolerable, whether the crisis cracks you open toward wholeness or calcifies you in comfortable dysfunction. The Jungian perspective reframes modern psychological suffering from a tale of biological defect to a drama of the soul. Your anxiety, your depression, your burnout, these aren't malfunctions. They're what Jung called fierce grace, disruptions that shatter your illusions and compel you toward the second half of life. The breakdown is the breaking open. The crisis is the invitation. These symptoms are the cracks in your persona through which the light of the self shines. They're the friction points where the false life grinds against the unlived life, where the borrowed scripts finally fail, where the provisional personality can no longer sustain its own weight. To stop medicating the soul is to accept this invitation, to recognize that your neurosis is a substitute for legitimate suffering, and that the only way through is to courageously exchange the proxy for the real. This means engaging the unconscious through dreams, through active imagination, through honest reflection on which parts of your life serve your depths and which serve only your adaptations. It means feeling the legitimate suffering in your body, the grief in your chest, the rage in your arms, the terror in your throat, rather than displacing it into manageable neurotic loops. Moving from a borrowed life of external validation to an authentic life of inner meaning requires descending into what Jung called the alchemical fire, the transformative heat of facing what you've been avoiding. The suffering is not the end of the road. It's the labor pains of the self waiting to be born. In a culture that pathologizes depth and sells you comfort, choosing to heed the soul's call is an act of radical resistance. It's the refusal to optimize yourself into a cyborg of efficiency. It's the choice to be deeply, uncomfortably, transformatively human, to honor the teleology of your pain and participate consciously in the unfolding of your own destiny. The psyche is speaking. The symptoms are its vocabulary, and you now have the grammar to decode what's being said. Thank you for exploring this with me. If this resonated, I invite you to like and subscribe. This work deepens when we're not alone in it. Share this with someone who might recognize themselves here, and leave a comment with your reflections. Thank you for doing this consciousness work. See you in the next exploration.